Hey folks, I've been asked a number of times to record this teaching on scriptures and matters concerning LGBTQ plus folk for a while. So this is going to be my surely flawed attempt to put something helpful out into the world to foster conversation and to help those who might be struggling with their faith or with their identity. It represents how myself and the church that I pastor worked through these passages and religious teachings about 10 years ago. And I've grown a little bit since then, and I think we all have. So I'm going to try to cover as many bases as I can in the following videos. And where I fall short, please reach out and offer what you can. And if there's something that you want to see that maybe I haven't talked about, please let me know that as well, and I'll add a video to the series. But I am not in the mood, nor will I ever be, to argue or even to discuss things with people who aren't going to discuss in good faith or are not willing to be in dialogue, but just simply monologue about real people and their place in the church and the world. So I'm not going to cast my pearls before swine, as the Lord suggested. So with that in mind, the rest of this video is sort of prologue to the other videos that are going to follow, and I'll give a preview about what those videos will entail a little bit later. So this is all prologue. This is all sort of my process and how I got there, what I'm going to be doing, and how we're going to be treating subject matter. So regardless of any other government or other organization, especially churches, how they legislate sexuality or gender identity issues, the church, as far as I'm concerned, has a responsibility to stand apart from them, both to judge their faults and to set a course for peace and love and faith and justice, regardless of what the rest of the world may or may not be doing. So to that end, this project is a result of ongoing conversations with the scriptures and scholars and folks from within the LGBTQ plus community itself. Since there's a wide diversity within communities around which labels are appropriate, and an even wider diversity of people on the outside who misunderstand or are misinformed about the identities that we'll be considering in this study, here's a real quick note on language. Many folk prefer the acronym LGBT, referring to folks who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. Other folks prefer to use the term queer for themselves, sometimes adding Q to the end of LGBTQ, or sometimes using queer as a catch-all phrase for anybody who's non-conforming in their gender or a sexual minority, gender sexual minority. So over time, other gender or sexual minorities, like those who are asexual or ace, those who are demisexual or pansexual or intersex, and their allies, they've been included in that terminology as well, often because they don't feel included anywhere else. And that's why we now see LGBT, queer, LGBTQ, or LGBTQIAA plus, or other acronyms used as communities continue to explore and to feel more comfortable drawing their own lines of distinction rather than having labels forced on them. In academic circles, I'm aware that the term GSM, or gender and sexual minorities, has been gaining favor. But since it has limited use for non-academics, I didn't feel like it was a really good fit for this project in particular. In non-academic circles, LGBTQ plus seems to be a good balance between inclusivity without being super unwieldy itself, with the caveat that its usage here includes all previously mentioned gender and sexual minorities in my usage. So years ago, I put off doing an exhaustive study of LGBTQ issues in the scripture, reasoning that it did not directly affect me, and of course, I was wrong. And since that time, I've learned many people that I deeply care about fall onto the LGBTQIAA plus spectrum. It was just wrong of me to think that just because something didn't affect me, that I was off the hook for considering it, even as that proved to be a false assumption, because it did affect me. The people that I love fell into that community. So I had first intended this survey to be exhaustive, but I don't feel like I can apply that label any longer to this, or really any biblical subject. So instead, what I think this study is to be as exhaustive as I can get without also exhausting my availability to those who care about me. There's always going to be more to say, and frankly, there's always going to be better people to say it. As I've worked through these matters, I've trusted the commitments that I've made to my faith along the way, to understand God and the church, to vindicate the conclusions that I would come to. And when I set out to do this a number of years ago, I wondered how I would feel once the data was in and once the discussion was concluded. I wondered if the data would lead me to a place that I didn't want to go. What would I do? So as a result, I decided to honor a commitment I made even longer ago, that if God and the truth were in any way friends, that God would want me to do this. God would advocate a search for truth, even if it seemed to move against what I believed at the time. So the following series of explorations represent an honest attempt on my part to wrestle with matters of great importance to me with all the resources that I have and had available. So here's a few notes on the method that I'll be using. I attempted to be as systematic as possible about the things that we're going to be discussing, so I try to cover all the bases I can while still remaining accessible to lay people. Scholars have no need of something like this. They can do the work themselves, and plenty of ink has been spilled in great measure on all of these things already. But first, here are the boundaries I gave myself while doing this. Number one, I prayed about this. I did not enter into such weighty matters lightly, but I did so with a desire for God to speak and for myself to be attentive rather than dismissive. Two, it's tempting to frame this discussion in terms of the homosexual issue or LGBTQ issues, but I didn't, and I still do not feel comfortable with that framework, as it tends to see real living people as an issue rather than real living people. As a result, I made every attempt not to reduce the discussion to the homosexual issue, but to constantly keep in mind the myriad folks who this is not an issue for them, but it's their identity. So thank you for your grace if and when I fail at that. Number three, many people have an unconscious aversion to thinking and talking about lesbians or gays or otherwise non-heteronormative people or actions. And in this, many cases, this is normal. That is, thinking about yourself in certain gay or lesbian situations. However, the same holds in reverse for those who aren't cisgender or heterosexual. It's just as likely that heterosexual intercourse would awaken an aversion in them. And this so-called ick factor might be a reality and may not be something that is so easily tossed aside, but it does not and should not factor into our discussion about God or the scriptures or our faith. How we personally feel or any revulsion that we may have is simply that's just a personal feeling. It's not God's feeling, and it's certainly not God's law. So I've left personal feelings out of this discussion. Fourth, I've tried to be faithful to how I understand our faith, and yet there are others, conservative or progressive or LGBTQ plus and not, who are trying to do the same. So no matter where the discussion goes, I'm not going to pretend that my answers are the answers, and I trust that even if the data or the spirit pulls us in different ways, it's not because one of us is being intentionally unfaithful, but that our journeys are not at different places, and try to endeavor not to disrespect people who disagree, to not dehumanize them, and trust that, like what Paul says in Philippians 3:15, if any of us think differently about anything, I trust that God will reveal it to you. Number five, the following are convenient labels that I borrowed from other sources to categorize various Christian responses that have been put forth over the years regarding various sexual expressions. So I'd hope that when I concluded this study that I would feel comfortable with one of these stances. And it turns out I was correct. So please note that these in no way reflect any particular church and certainly do not reflect God's views, but these are simply responses that the church has held in its various incarnations towards people in the LGBTQ plus community over history. So the first possible option as far as the way that the church reacts to those in the LGBTQ community is A, considering that their actions or themselves is a rejection of God's design. That is, being LGBTQ simply goes against God's designs, God's will, and should be rejected in all ways and in all circumstances. They believe that LGBTQ folks should not be members of the church, they shouldn't lead, and they aren't even, it's not even possible for them to be Christian. B, another way of viewing acceptance or not is to be welcoming and not affirming. That is, they affirm a sort of Christian love that requires openness, receptivity, and kindness to all human persons, regardless of any other factor, including the particularity of any kind of human sin. Those who identify as LGBTQ plus and their actions are considered sinful in this paradigm, but all of those whom the Christian community welcomes into its worship and its fellowship, they're all sinners as well. And so this is the sort of love the sinner, hate the sin type mentality where everybody's welcome. You're supposed to love everybody, but you do not approve, and you make it known that you don't approve of their lifestyle and whatever. Usually these folks don't have LGBTQ members or leaders, but they will welcome you into the community if you're LGBTQ plus. C, a third way of interacting with the LGBTQ plus community is to be welcoming and accommodating. That is, the Christian community accepts the integrity of LGBTQ plus Christians and same-sex unions, whatever they may be, and they demonstrate hospitality and compassion to their brothers and sisters who are LGBTQIA++. In many cases, the cisgender heterosexual relationship of marriage remains normative for this group. Although an LGBTQ plus union is not necessarily the intention of God, it's nonetheless understandable and acceptable as an alternative to those who are alternatively attracted or alternatively gendered. And then D, a fourth way of interacting with the LGBTQ plus community from the church side is to be welcoming and celebrating. That is, like celibacy, gays, lesbians, transgender, bisexuality, those identities or the transition thereof, or being non-binary or being, queer in general, they are variations or maybe even corrections of creation that do not diminish the authenticity of a person's humanness, but like the cisgender heterosexual orientation of life, and an LGBTQ plus person or a way of being in the world is a human way of being in the world. It's a gift of God to be celebrated. It's not a disorder of a fallenness. Homosexuality, bisexuality, transgender identity, intersexuality, asexuality, those are differences precisely in their variations. They are a blessing of God. They belong to God's declaration of the goodness of creation. In some cases, adjustments may need to be made to accommodate and celebrate those whose needs are not normative for the community, but they are acceptable and celebrated nonetheless. This would be like, for example, having large print Bibles in your churches for people who see things differently, or having hearing aids for those who hear differently. It doesn't suggest that there's something wrong with LGBTQ plus folk, as perhaps those metaphors might have suggested, but it does suggest that certain accommodations for the enhanced comfort of LGBTQ plus folk and inclusion after lifetimes of not being comfortable and being hurt might be appropriate for churches to adopt. Of course, somebody could imagine, it's not very hard to imagine a paradigm of response that accepts some, but not all of the identities contained within the LGBTQIA plus spectrum, and thus ends up as sort of a hybrid between one or more of the above. But for our purposes, we're going to assume that if such distinctions are necessary, we can make them particular later. So here's what we're going to do. Here's what the next couple of sessions look like. There's relatively few scriptures on which most of the discussion about LGBTQ plus matters and the Bible hinge. The following is not exclusive, and it changes based on the particular matter, but here's where we're going to start. We're going to start in Genesis 19, in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Then the next session, we're going to move on to Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20. The next session, we're going to talk about Romans chapter 1, and we're going to move on to 1 Corinthians, then 1 Timothy. We're going to talk about Genesis 1:21 and Deuteronomy 22:5, where we talk about transgender issues. And then there are other avenues that are of scriptural importance beyond simply looking at verses that seem to go one way or the other in regards to LGBTQ plus matters. So after the scriptural discussion, we'll turn to a general discussion of love and marriage in the Bible, some thoughts on gender in the scriptures, then a small but important discussion on how we interpret scripture in general, and then a final chat in conclusion based on the things that we discussed in total. First, though, and maybe last for this video, is I want to note that it is generally a wrong-headed idea to go into a discussion of these verses primarily to decide what each says about matters surrounding LGBTQ plus identity. That's a cardinal sin in biblical interpretation. That is, one should never approach a text to find out what it says about X. Rather, you should let the text speak out of its own language and its culture and its context, and then once you've allowed it to do so, you can see clearly whether or not it even addresses X, that issue. So with that particular thing in mind, I'm going to first turn to the discussion of the biblical story of Sodom and Gomorrah. So if that's of interest to you, I will see you next time.